Okay, is this going to do it? Yes! Okay, finally we're back after YouTube's god-awful... whatever. But we're back, and that's... Now, continue the live skinning of Kamala Harris.
Oh, well, basically, I'm going to have a short book about Kamala Harris that'll be available shortly. More of a pamphlet booklet. It's not in a biography or anything. It's kind of an essay using her life to make some key political points, and the fact that she is the vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party to kind of show where we are as a country, what's really going on. But basically, she's the candidate that the supporters of Hillary Clinton kind of put all their money and support behind in the primary. The American people didn't like her. They didn't like her record. They especially didn't like her record after it was exposed by Tulsi Gabbard. They rejected her. And so Joe Biden is the nominee. And now they are sneaking her back onto the ticket. Everybody knows that Joe Biden comes across pretty senile. He's pretty old, and he may not make it through his first 4 years. So there's a very good chance that Joe Biden will step down because he's got Alzheimer's or he's just old or whatever. And we're going to end up with President Kamala Harris. And that's something people should really think about, because look at her record. I mean, I said it before. I don't know if people heard, but a person that seems to just have no ethical qualms about destroying other people's lives in order to advance themselves. And that's quite disturbing.
Completely hypocritical.
Yeah, indeed. So
I do the weed, kids. I'm cool. Also, I'm going to throw in jail for it. So,
Yeah, and like I said, the time when she ascended as a prosecutor in the 90s, that's when the term super predator was all over U.S. media, playing up the idea that young black males were somehow, the most dangerous group of people, and you should be really, really afraid. One thing that went on all over the country was when a young black male would be on trial, they would have what they called a gang expert who would testify. And the gang expert knew nothing about the case. They were just an expert witness who would just scare the crap out of the jury, telling them horror stories about what gangs do. The gangs are awful and all of that. And jurors would just get horrified hearing these stories about gangs, and then convict the person on trial. The craziest thing about the U.S. legal system, and this, people do not know this. If you haven't dealt with the U.S. legal system, you wouldn't know this. As somebody, when I was in Cleveland, I went to court with police brutality victims, and I saw the U.S. legal system up front, right? If you're a defendant, you really don't have a chance, okay? Like, it's the conviction rate for juries is astronomically high. In the Bronx in New York City, it's a low conviction rate because only 67% of people who go to trial are convicted. Well, most people don't go to trial. Like 99% of cases do not go to trial. So if someone's going to trial, which is going to take years of their life, usually it takes a couple of years before you have a trial. You're going to spend a huge amount of money on lawyers. You're going to go through a nightmare. You're going to be missing work endlessly for court dates until finally your trial happens. If someone is going to go through the expense of a trial, through the trauma of a trial, being on trial in the United States, they're probably innocent, right? I mean, now maybe they're just rich, right? I mean, rich people have trials because they can afford it and they have the money and whatever. But if a normal, average working class person is going to go to trial in the United States, the overwhelming chances are that they are innocent if they don't take a plea deal. A lot of innocent people take plea deals. But if someone's going to actually go to trial, they're probably innocent, regardless, right? In most municipalities in the United States, 80% conviction rate, 90% conviction rate, juries convict people, right? When juries acquit people, it's very, very rare. And prosecutors, they have the whole government behind them, right? There's no limit on the amount of resources they have, right?
Yeah. From what I've seen, basically when these situations happen, a cop does a police brutality, suddenly the prosecutor forgets how to prosecute.
Oh, that, of course. And that's the other thing. Alan Dershowitz, who's one of the most well-respected legal scholars in the United States, not an upstanding individual, in my opinion, he himself talks about how police lie on the witness stand all the time. Police perjury is routine. Cops get on the witness stand and tell bold-faced lies that are revealed in court to be bold-faced lies, and they don't get prosecuted for it. Why? Because when cops testify, they're testifying to help prosecutors. So why would prosecutors punish people who are helping them? So the legal system is, I mean, if you're on trial in the United States, you're probably going to be convicted. So, the fact that in the 90s you had this fear of young black males, this racist stereotype of a super predator. You had gang experts, scaring the pants off of jurors with horror stories about gang violence and such. I mean, it's like this woman, she rose to power in a huge, juggernaut of racism and mass incarceration. That's where her career comes from. And she's somebody who should have known better because she grew up as an anti-racist activist. I mean, she grew up going to civil rights rallies and hanging out with black nationalists like Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka, who hung out at her parents' house. And she was good. She went to a community center that was run by a friend of James Baldwin. So she should know better. She still did this because she has no concern about other people and how her life decisions affect other people. So I think that anybody who's at all concerned about justice should be disturbed by Kamala Harris. I'm not saying Trump is better, mind you. There's plenty of things about Trump that are wildly disturbing to me. I mean, goodness gracious. I'm not telling people to vote for Trump. I'm not telling people to vote for Biden. I'm telling people that the Democratic Party in the United States is not a socialist party. It's not an anti-fascist party. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party both represent very, very dangerous sides of the U.S. ruling class. And that's the situation we're in.
Yeah, and that's really speaks to the way that American politics in general has just utterly collapsed in the last 4 years. And it's just gone... It's gone straight to hell. And I know I've said this in a previous video, but, as an outsider looking in, it kind of looks like the inmates are running the asylum kind of thing. Because it's frightening when you see the people. Yeah, have you seen those videos? Trump supporters say the darndest things.
No, I haven't.
Okay, don't, because you'll lose brain cells if you do.
Yeah.
There's people asking what Barack Obama was doing in the White House on 9/11, and I mean that should be pretty obvious what's wrong with that statement.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Wow.
So.
Wow. Yeah. So, I will say one of the things that disturbed me most that Donald Trump did was when he was having a clash with Ilhan Omar, the congresswoman. And she's obviously not born in the United States. He, in his, his attack on her in one of his speeches, he had the audience start chanting. He started saying that she's a socialist, that she opposes our American system. And then he had the audience start chanting the phrase, "Send her back, send her back." And I actually asked a few Trump supporters, I said to them, so we should deport people on the basis of their political views. Now, what if she had been born here and she was a socialist? Should we deport her then? Now, what if she was what if she was like just a Democrat but not a socialist? Should we still deport her? I mean, it's not a defensible position, right? I mean, but it's like it's just they just that's what the crowd was saying, right? She thinks differently. She advocates socialism, so she should be forced out of the country. That makes that's like indefensible, but that's how these kind of the Trump mob thinks, right? I mean, it's just kind of if you have a certain viewpoint, we should deport you from the country. And that's just primitive, barbaric thinking. And it's beyond me. And then every time I would point that out to Trump supporters, they would say, well, Trump didn't really mean that. And I'd say, no. He meant that. Yeah. And you meant that until 2 seconds ago when I explained to you how illogical it was. And you meant that. And now you're backtracking. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable. But, they're starting in now with Kamala Harris as a Marxist. Well, her dad, right, you could call her dad. He's an economist. He's influenced by Marx. He's not a communist. I mean, dad's like a social democrat. He studied Marxian economics. He was kind of an advisor to some governments of Jamaica. But I wouldn't call him a Marxist or a revolutionary. But he's an economist, I guess. He's more familiar with Keynesian economics, favors kind of a social democratic model. His writing is about unemployment rates and such. He taught at Stanford for a long time before he retired, but he was never a communist. And she hates him. She's estranged from him. They don't speak to each other. He denounced her after her pot smoking comment. He's quite critical of her and doesn't think highly of her. So I would say that this is how insane politics is in the United States. I mean, What's weird is that both sides buy into this false definition of socialism. Socialism is when the government does stuff.
I I I
Yeah.
I, I do actually have a Canadian kind of comparison to that.
Okay.
In the New Democrat Party, which is our social democrats who used to be socialists when when communist parties got outlawed, and they formed one called the New Democratic Party. Now they're just social democrats, funded by big unions, blah blah blah. There was a guy on YouTube a long, long time ago. He used to run a channel called Stalin's Cafe. I don't know if anybody remembers that one. Or the Stalin Cafe, or Coffee with Stalin, or something like that. Now, he ended up becoming a candidate for the New Democratic Party. So, he basically ditched all the socialism, went into bourgeois politics, and all of that. I mean, it's a common thing that happens. But I remember the outrage from the conservatives saying, look at this radical left-wing Marxist Stalinist is going to gulag all of us if he gets elected. And it's the guy's just a member of Parliament for Niagara Falls. Not only did he not win, but I mean, he's just a member of Parliament. He has a very, very limited powers. It's less power than a governor. It's more akin to that of a mayor. Actually, no, I'm not right. He would be completely subject to the discipline of the New Democratic Party. He wouldn't actually hold any power whatsoever. But I remember the red baiting and the red scaring over this one tiny little guy that used to be a Marxist. I mean, you really can't call somebody who runs in a Social Democratic Party a communist. I mean, no offense to the guy, but you know what I mean. Like, it's hard to make the argument, although people still do, that you're a radical left-wing Marxist when you're running in a bourgeois government. But I remember that. That's something that you didn't see that much here. But I have to say, since Trump got elected, that emboldened a lot of the far right that was very quiet here for a long time. They always had a very low-key way of being racist, you know what I mean? Where you don't say something that's racist, but you rather imply a policy or a position that is racist. And a lot of these people are now just straight coming out and saying it. And according to a lot of studies, the Social Democratic Party lost, the NDP here lost a lot of votes because the guy who's running it is Sikh. He's got the turban, he's got everything. Jagmeet Singh. Then he used to have his thing, Jag meet and greet and meet the candidates. Okay, funny little thing. But then he would have these, Jag meet and greet, and then the conservatives would run up to him and say, I don't want a Muslim running the country, and I run of Islam, Sharia law, and the fucking guy is not Muslim.
Right.
And it drove me bloody insane.
Oh wow. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. No, it was pointed out, there was a horrendous shooting a few years back at a Sikh temple here in the United States where some racist, showed up at a Sikh temple and just opened fire and killed a bunch of people. It was horrendous. And almost every time there's a mass shooting in the United States, the National Rifle Association, they'll say, well, the answer to mass shootings is more guns. If only, there had been a good guy with a gun there, it would have stopped it. But when the shooting was at a Sikh temple, they didn't say that. The idea of a group of, brown people with guns is not appealing to the National Rifle Association. And that's very, very telling. Very, very telling. The other thing is that, yes, after 9/11 here in New York City, there were a whole lot of violent attacks on Sikhs, even though Sikhs are not Muslims. But because they wear a turban.
Same thing happened here.
Yeah, people think, people associate the turban with the Middle East, and it's just, the level of ignorance is deeply shocking. And when people are like that, it's deeply, deeply tragic. I mean, it's kind of like when you'll get people like Milo Yiannopoulos or Ben Shapiro, and they start, justifying like U.S. attacks on Iraq or U.S. attacks on Libya and they'll start talking about Sharia law, and it's like, well, no, that's in Saudi Arabia, which is our ally, right? It's the governments in the Middle East that we target tend to be the most progressive, and it's like, well, somehow what Saudi Arabia does is an argument for why we should have overthrown the Ba'athist Arab Socialist government of Iraq. I mean, it's just ignorant. It's just very, very ignorant. It's very tragic that people really, I mean, they don't know anything. It's funny. I made a post yesterday because I was talking to a friend of mine, and I actually recalled when I was in school in 6th grade, we had an assignment, and our assignment was to write like a little essay. What would you do if you were the president? And I wasn't like, I mean, I was in 6th grade. I was like nowhere near. I didn't really understand politics, but I was thinking a lot about politics. So I wrote kind of a political essay, and she took me out in the hall. And I remember she said, Mr. Maupin, I respect your views. You're entitled to your opinion. But for this assignment, we need you to write something like give everyone free ice cream.
So basically the childhood equivalent of Vermin Supreme.
I guess. Yeah. I mean, it was just like, please don't think too deeply about this. It was kind of that's the way a lot of people are, though. I think a lot of people have a real fear of thinking.
Isn't that just so typical? The education system saw the potential to encourage someone who was very young to think more, and then just stomp the shit out of it with ice cream.
Yeah, I mean, she wasn't mean about it. She was very kind. She was just kind of like, that's not what I want you to do with this assignment. It's like, okay. But Noam Chomsky, one of the points he makes is, if you listen to sports radio, like people that are like baseball fans or football, they will talk about it with a huge depth, right? And that they will like have the rule books memorized, and they will know statistics up, down, backwards, and forwards. And it's like, why are people so knowledgeable about that when it comes to politics? Not so much. And it's because there's no social consequence for knowing about sports, right? But if you have, an intense knowledge of politics, there are consequences. Your boss might not agree. Your coworkers might not agree. Members of your family might not agree with you. And that there's a bigger consequence. And that people tend to know a lot about baseball and football and stuff because it's safe. And that the consequences aren't there. Do you agree with that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, just look at, everything that, I've done in the last 11 and a half years. Anytime I go to apply for a job, I got to worry about all this stuff being dug up. I mean, I'm kind of completely screwed on any kind of a corporate job in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what do you mean, though? I mean, they would make you the head of a university because they're all communists, right? I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I should do that.
Right. I mean, it's really ridiculous. But yeah, I mean, we're in this very, very strange period. But what is reassuring to me is that the amount of people that are interested in the ideas that you and I talk about is vastly expanding. I mean, look at the social media presence. I mean, goodness gracious, it used to be nobody talked about this. But now the number of people streaming and talking about Marxism and socialism and Mao and Lenin, and it's like, there's been an explosion of interest in the ideas that you and I have been talking about for a decade,
Yeah,
I think that's the thing.
The speed of which information is now traveling, which has both been a blessing and a curse. But I would say, overall, I would still say it's been a blessing.
Yeah, I saw you did a video about Bob Avakian telling people to vote for Joe Biden. Did you what did you think of that? I mean, I saw your video, but do you mind if I comment on that? Or
yeah, he basically told his supporters to vote for Joe Biden, and I just thought this is the exact reason, or one of the major reasons, why the RCP broke off from the CPUSA to begin with.
Well, the RCP didn't exactly break off from the CPUSA, right? It was, there was the Students for a Democratic Society, which was kind of the big activist group in the 60s. They were like radical students, I guess. And as the decade went on, a lot of them became more radical and got into Mao and stuff. And so there was the idea of like forming a new party. And Avakian and his kind of allies in Students for a Democratic Society, they had a group in Berkeley, like a study group, an activist group called the Revolutionary Union. It went national, became the Revolutionary Union of the country. And then in 1975, they announced the formation of a new party. They didn't exactly break away. I mean, there were some people probably from the old CP who were with them. I know one of the people was very key in setting up the RCP was a guy named Label Bergman. He was the head of the Communist Party of Montana in the 1930s, and he was like an old man in the 60s and 70s, and he was kind of the mentor, and he was kind of a mentor to Bob Avakian and stuff. And he traveled to China a lot. He had quit the CP over Khrushchev in 1956, but then he supported Deng Xiaoping, and so Avakian and him had a big falling out, and they stopped speaking to each other in 1976, 1978 or 9. It's kind of interesting, but yeah, I mean, the RCP, they've been kind of doing this for years. The first time they did this was before they were reformed, and they were the Revolutionary Union. When Richard Nixon was being impeached, it had the impeachment hearings and stuff. They formed something called the Workers' Committee, and they were having rallies calling for Richard Nixon to be impeached from office, calling him a fascist. And at that point, the RCP was like the opposite of now, but they were really playing up kind of that they were like a party of like low-income white workers, which they were not. A lot of them went to Harvard and Yale and places like that. But they would wear flannel shirts and like they'd have construction worker hats on at their rallies, and they played up the idea they're a workers' committee. They want to throw that bum out. And, it was like they were trying to play up the idea they were the party of low-income white workers. They did that. When Ronald Reagan was in office, they had a campaign called No Business as Usual, which was like arguing that Ronald Reagan was going to create a nuclear war, and calling him a fascist, comparing him to Hitler and such, and that we have to get Reagan out, we have to drive out Reagan, or no business as usual. Then in the 2000s they did drive out the Bush regime, the world can't wait, and again, like the logo they actually used was an image of the Earth like in flames. Like the idea was if Bush was not impeached, like the Earth would burst into flames or something. They did that. What's different about this time, now they've got Refuse Fascism, which is their anti-Trump organization. What's interesting about it this time is that they never went as far as telling people to vote, right? That's big. The RCP always basically called for like an election boycott. They would say like voting doesn't change anything. We need a revolution. Now they're telling people to vote. That's pretty big. And it shows how desperate they are. They really, they see Trump as so much more dangerous than Reagan, so much more dangerous than Bush, when in reality, I actually feel like, with Trump, I'm not in favor of Trump, but I'm not sure Biden's better than Trump. You know what I'm saying? I usually always felt, the Democrats are slightly better. The 2016 election and this election, I'm not sure of that. I'm honestly not sure. I mean, they might be better. There's certainly some strong arguments. They're certainly not in favor of repressing immigrant communities as much. They're not supporting the police as much. But then on international issues, the Democrats seem to be more aggressive internationally. Plus, a lot of the talk the Democrats have against Donald Trump at this point is they're saying that he's a quote-unquote populist and that they need a big crackdown on social media and on the internet to make sure that that quote-unquote disinformation doesn't get out there and that alternative ideas don't get out there, so something like a Trump can never happen again. I find all that to be very, very scary. I read Joe Biden's article in Foreign Affairs magazine, the magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations, where he laid out what a Biden administration would do differently than Trump. And honestly, some of it was very scary to me. So I don't know. I'm at this point, Trump seems pretty awful. This trade war against China is awful. His handling of the pandemic has been awful. But Kamala Harris scares me a lot. So I'm not sure who's better. The RCP is absolutely sure. Why? Because they are in that kind of woke liberal milieu where what matters is the particular liberal issues of the day. They are trying to recruit liberals, and they're using this, Republicans are fascists, to try and recruit liberals, to build coalitions with liberals, to get liberals to donate money and help support their protests. And they don't seem to realize the country is very big, and that there are a lot of people who, out of their confusion, support Donald Trump. That if you actually were able to talk to them about socialism and actually get them to understand that the problem is capitalism, not immigrants, not the lack of a police state. There's a lot of people, I think, that are Trump supporters that support Trump because they think he's fighting the system. He's not. He's not fighting the system. And, they identify the Democrats with business as usual, the ordinary way things are. I think there's a lot of Trump supporters that are confused and support Trump because they don't see socialism as an alternative. And that's why Trump is working so hard to convince his base that Joe Biden's a communist. That's why he's trying to do that. He's trying to say the status quo is communist, and it's not. And if we look like shills for Joe Biden, then we're kind of reinforcing Trump's message. See, the status quo is communist. Well, it's not.
Well, yeah, that's why we don't advocate voting for a bourgeois party. But I think one of the main problems is that our ideological position requires a great deal of investigation. It's not simple. Racism is simple. The big, scary, whatever flavor of the month it is very simple. I read an article on Politico that shows that among bankers and, for lack of a better term, the financial aristocracy are beginning to back Joe Biden. And this would be taken as proof of what Trump says, when in reality it's far more complicated than that. I think it represents a definite shift. The bankers, the financial bourgeoisie, have gotten what they wanted. They got their deregulation, they got their tax cuts, and now it's time to get rid of them.
And they also want stability.
Yes.
That's the main thing. Yeah, whereas Trump represents instability to a lot of people. He represents further polarization of the country. He represents, more distance between red states and blue states, more unrest in the streets. And I think the bankers, because they're, that's finance capital is at the center of it all, right? I mean, that's Lenin's book, Imperialism. The highest stage of capitalism talks about finance capital being at the top. And, they want stability, right? They want to make sure the country's stable because they're already at the top of the game. The people supporting Donald Trump, like Bernie Marcus, the owner of Home Depot, the Koch brothers, who else is supporting Trump at this point? You got Sheldon Adelson, the real estate giant in Nevada. They are capitalists who feel like they're locked out of the club. They feel like that they've been locked out, that the ultra rich have all the power, and they want Trump to deregulate, and they want a chance to get some of their own. Betsy DeVos, the billionaire Secretary of Education, who's in the Trump administration. She's a billionaire. She's part of the ruling class. Where does her money come from? Tupperware.
And
right?
I will say, I suspect her to be a child trafficker as well.
Well, her money comes from Amway, the pyramid scheme, right? The multi-level marketing scheme. I shouldn't say pyramid. I just want to clarify what I said. There was an article by the New York Times that some of the children who went missing from the refugee camps ended up in Christian adoption programs. That Betsy DeVos was on a board member of. And I would consider taking children away from their families at gunpoint and then handing them over to new families to, for the lack of a better term, indoctrinate them into Christianity and probably erasing their Mexican or South American heritage. I would consider that to be a form of child trafficking. I just wanted to clarify what I said. Oh, sure. And I shouldn't use the word pyramid scheme because there's actually a specific legal definition of that, and Amway makes sure not to operate in that way. They're a multi-level marketing scheme.
Yeah, the other the other MLM.
Yeah. But as far as the religious stuff that you're talking about and the adoption programs and all of that, there's some really ugly history with all of that, right? That's a big thing in the Republican Party, and the neocons in particular have had an alliance with the religious right. And, Bush pushed something called the Faith-Based Initiative. And it was giving money to religious groups to do things that the government does. But here's the thing. That already goes on. There are government-funded Catholic or Protestant orphanages. There are government-funded, every private school in the United States gets money from the government to some degree or other. A lot of them are religious. Faith-Based Initiative was about changing the rules because, yes, you can have a church-run orphanage in the United States, but you're not allowed to indoctrinate the kids while they're there, right? It's like you couldn't be the church. You can have this program, that you can't force the kids to go to Bible study or whatever. Faith-based initiative was starting to mess with those rules, and that's what Betsy DeVos, Mike Pence, they've started to mess with that to make it to start to blatantly have the government sponsorship of particular religious groups, which is not constitutional in the United States.
I know a perfect example of that. There's a charity in Arizona for people who are addicted to drugs. So you have to, if you're a drug addict and you need help and you go to these people, we've got the state money for helping it. We've got all the resources you need, but you have to become an evangelical Christian and you have to pledge your support to Israel. Now, I think that's a little really goddamned unethical to try to force politics on someone who's suffering from drug addiction. For the life of me, I cannot remember the name of the organization. I think the person they are watching me in the chat knows the name of. I think they know the name of the organization, but I think it's like Light or Door or something like that. But again, they receive state funds to try to help get people. Home of Hope, that's the name. Thank you. They are watching me. Home of Hope. They take you in and try to get you cleaned up, and then it's not even like, here's some stuff, we'd appreciate it if you read it. It's this, here's some stuff you read, and you have to follow it. Period. Yeah. And then you have to pledge support to Israel. It says, well, I came here to get off drugs, not get on a new drug called Zionism. Well,
there's a number of U.S. states that are now requiring all state employees to sign a pledge they will not boycott Israel. It's like the state law, and that's insane in my opinion. The other thing is that, if you talk, I've talked to people who do activism around Rikers Island, which is the prison facility here in New York City. It's, and they've talked about how a lot of the drug rehab programs at Rikers are completely worthless because instead of actually giving people like medical, mental health care to get them, off of drugs, they have, religious people that just kind of, pray with them and, give them religious speeches. And that's one of the grievances a lot of prisoners have is they say they want some real help with their addiction. They want some real counseling. And instead they just get religious people who talk at them, but I'm sure religious people who talk at them are much cheaper than actually qualified mental health professionals. That's the problem, I guess.
Oh yeah, definitely. There's that's a general thing that's done even here. That's actually one of the things that you could criticize capitalism for, that it deliberately de-skills labor for the sake of simple costs. Like you call up your cell phone company because something's wrong with your phone, whatever. You don't talk to a technician. You talk to a customer service representative that's like minimum wage who has a script to go off of. And you go through all of that, and then if that doesn't work, then you end up talking to an actual technician. I know because I worked in the hospital system for Niagara. The people who watch patients who are on suicide or they're dangerous or something like that, they bring in me, a minimum wage security guard, not an actual trained health professional. And that was kind of intimidating. Here's a person with major mental health issues, and then you drop me, a minimum wage nobody with no education, to watch this. And it can be intimidating at times, but they do that because you can pay me minimum wage where you would have to pay a registered nurse like $25 or $35 an hour to do it. And that's a thing that goes around in capitalism. We could extend this into Ford and how a guy with skill to build a car was replaced with an assembly line where one person just does one thing, one simple motion over and over and over again. So you could de-skill the labor, pay it less, and then rate of profit, blah, blah, blah. But you could expand it into all those kinds of things.
Sure, absolutely. But, this is the system that we live under. But, one thing that you had mentioned before, when we talk about the RCP and endorsing, Joe Biden essentially, and, During the Occupy Wall Street protests, the mayor in Oakland, California, Occupy Oakland. I mean, that's where like Boots Riley was. It was one of the more radical, more pro-communist Occupy protests was in Oakland, California. But the mayor of Oakland, California, who shut it down, Jean Quan, she was a former leader of a Maoist party. She was a leader of the Communist Workers' Party, right? And so she was the person working to shut down Occupy Oakland was a former Maoist. And, the Communist Workers' Party was a Maoist grouping in the USA in the 70s. It was kind of a rival to the RCP. And they actually were famous for the fact that they had a rally in 1979 in Greensboro, North Carolina. And it was called a Death to the Klan rally. And the KKK showed up and shot 5 of them at their rally.
Oh, well, that's not funny.
Yeah, it was called the Greensboro Massacre, and it's later been revealed.
Yeah, I do remember that.
Yeah, and it's been revealed that among the Klansmen who shot these communists, among them were actually informers for the Bureau of Alcohol, Firearms, and Tobacco and the FBI. And so, it was a particularly ugly incident. And then after that, the Communist Workers' Party, for a while, they changed their name to like the New Democratic Movement or something like that. And then they tried to become kind of a Christian religious organization. And they kind of just dissolved. And there are a lot of like nonprofits. It was primarily an Asian American organization. And there are a lot of nonprofits in California and in New York City that are run by former members of the Communist Workers' Party. But if you talk to them, I mean, yeah, they did that in the 70s. They don't believe in communism anymore. There's a woman on the New York City Council, Margaret Chin. She was a leader of the Communist Workers' Party at one point. She doesn't believe in communism. You talk to her, she doesn't believe in communism. I mean, she's a big supporter of Israel, big supporter of U.S. foreign policy. She's just the typical Democrat. But yeah, when she was young, and that's the thing is in the 70s, when, China was, it was the Gang of Four period. They were putting out much more radical politics. Plus, there had been the Black Panthers and, in urban areas for people that were part of ethnic minority communities, to be a community activist, to be a community leader who was in politics, the kind of person who might run for office, to be a communist was pretty normal. I mean, you watch the movie Network. Have you ever seen Network?
1984? 1885?
Yeah. It was kind of a hit movie, but it was about the 70s and kind of the political atmosphere. And, you watch the movie Car Wash that came out during that period. There's it's in that movie. And it was in the culture. Being a Maoist communist was something people did. The Black Panthers were around, and it was something people did. And so that's why, this former mayor of Oakland, Jean Quan, who was the mayor during the crackdown on Occupy, Margaret Chin in the New York City Council. Yeah, they used to be communists, but they're not anymore, and they so clearly aren't anymore. The only people who even care that they used to be communists are like crazy right-wingers on the internet. Even their opponents in the political races don't even bring that up because it's so obviously ridiculous if you look at the way they act now.
I know, but you can red scare for basically anything. But let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Now, I fully admit my ignorance on this situation. I do not understand the situation in Belarus. I don't have the first clue how Belarusian politics goes. You do, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, though. Usually, but ask me what you're going to ask me. I'll let you finish the question.
Can you give us basically an idea of what's going on?
Well, Belarus is referred to commonly as the last Soviet republic. The largest party represented in the parliament is the Communist Party. The president, Alexander Lukashenko, speaks very highly of the Soviet Union. There are monuments to Lenin and to the Soviet Union that are still widely on display. The industries are all still nationalized. Employment is still guaranteed by the state. And the USA has obviously been trying to overthrow Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. They see him as a communist holdout, the last outpost of tyranny, blah, blah, blah. They'd like to have free market capitalism there. There's every time he wins the elections, there's a layer of kind of middle class kids who go out and break stuff and declare it's a dictatorship, etc. What's different this time is that Lukashenko has responded to the pandemic pretty horribly. Okay, his response to the pandemic was pretty bad. I mean, it was a comment. I think he said something like, you can cure COVID with vodka or something like that. Obviously not a very good thing to say. He kind of mishandled COVID. The other thing...
For the sake of people out there, I will try that.
Okay. The other thing is that, he's been seen, especially since Putin has been in office, he's been seen as kind of an ally of Russia because Russia is in an anti-imperialist, situation where so he's been seen as kind of an ally of Russia. Lately, in the last year or so, he's been kind of giving the middle finger to Russia and kissing up to Washington, and being friendly to the United States. So, so he's mishandled COVID. He's alienating Russia. So now, they just had their election again. The official result is, 79, 80% voted for him. There's protests like there always are after he wins, but it seems like the protests this time have a lot more people backing them up because there's a lot more. It's not just the typical group of pro-U.S., pro-capitalist kids breaking stuff, okay? There's people that are mad about his handling of COVID. There are people that want him to be friendlier to Russia, I think, that are in the streets. So it's complicated what's going on there. I think the USA still wants to overthrow him. And I think the USA and the State Department and all that are still involved in efforts to destabilize Belarus. But I also feel like there are probably people in Belarus who maybe want him to be friendlier to Russia and want him to stop, trying to alienate, Russia, which is an important neighbor and ally. I think there are also people that are angry about his handling of the COVID. I think that there's a widespread problem of corruption in the country. So it's more complicated than usual. In a situation like this where you have a historically anti-imperialist leader, and then you have a group of people out in the streets protesting and being cheered on by the U.S. media. You just want to say, okay, CIA color revolution, been there, done that. In this situation, unfortunately, because of the way things have gotten, it is a little bit more complicated than that. And my hope is that they can adjust their system in Belarus to be more effective, to effectively fight COVID-19, to effectively raise people out of poverty, to effectively move in a more socialistic direction, that they can establish better friendly ties with different countries around the world. My hope is that this doesn't degenerate into another like Euromaidan kind of situation. Because if you look at Ukraine, that's been a mess, right? And my hope is that whatever happens, there can be a resolution to this, where the protesters' voices are heard on the one hand, but there's not a regime change push coming from the United States. My hope is that this can be resolved because whenever this happens, and this is what gets my goat. I just don't get, Libya. They were saying to us, oh my God, Gaddafi is so awful. Well, look at Libya now, right? No one in their right mind would say that Libya benefited from the 2011 NATO intervention. People said Iraq.
We did it, Patrick.
Yeah.
We saved the city.
Yeah, right. Iraq, they said Saddam Hussein was so bad. Oh, well, look at Iraq now. Is anybody in their right mind going to say things have gotten better? Afghanistan, same story. And that, they always are trying to sell us this idea that, that the Pentagon is a humanitarian rescue organization and these people are being oppressed by this brutal regime that does brutal, awful stuff. And, we have to intervene. Don't be an isolationist, blah, 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 blah. We've heard it over and over and over again. And the reality is that U.S. regime change destroys countries. And it has catastrophic results, not just for the country in question, but for the whole region usually. It leads to the expansion of terrorist groups, of drug gangs. Afghanistan, great example, now the heroin capital of the world. So, U.S. regime change operations, U.S. destabilizations, the U.S. State Department, backing and supporting protests that overthrow governments never leads to anything good. But yet, what shocks me is that every time it happens, not only do average normal people who watch CNN support it. I mean, you kind of almost expect them to support it.
Oh, yeah.
But a lot of communists do. And I cannot get my mind around this. A lot of Trotskyites, a lot of anarcho-communists, a lot of, socialists, libertarians, they cannot bring themselves to disapprove of a CIA color revolution. It's like they just, every time they see one, it's like, I don't know what it is. They just cannot bring themselves to not support it. I mean, it blows my mind.
I fully admit that I made that mistake once. I made that mistake once years and years
But you
ago,
learned.
and I will never do it again. And that speaks very much to the liberal mentality because one of the news sources I watched when I originally started doing this whole YouTube thing was Keith Olbermann, very, very big liberal, very big liberal. He every day about the war, the crimes, KBR, Halliburton, malfeasance, taking public money and thing. And then when he got his own, and then he got taken off of MSNBC. I don't even know what happened there. But then when he got his own show on, I think it was Vice. Vice gave him a show. The very first show he did was with Michael Moore. Yeah, also, another big anti-war voice, turns around and starts bashing Gaddafi. Very first show. Because it was Obama.
Yep. Yeah, and I will say Gaddafi, he took a similar move prior to, the situation that ultimately led to his downfall. He thought the United States was his friend. He alienated the Palestinians. He alienated Russia and China in a lot of ways, and he thought that, he made this deal with BP. They returned the guys that were, I believe, falsely accused of being the Lockerbie bombers in Scotland, and they were returned to Libya, and they got a big parade. And I think Gaddafi was under the impression that the USA liked him. And he was dead wrong about that. I mean, he was absolutely wrong about that. But the Libya situation, right? You learned from it, right? Okay, yeah. You fell for it once. You learned from it. What blows my mind, right, is Susan Rice, who was like the second runner-up. She was like who Biden might have picked if he didn't pick Kamala Harris. She actually said that Gaddafi was distributing Viagra to men all over Libya to rape women. Okay? She said that. She said that. That's an awful allegation, right?
That doesn't sound made up at all.
And it turns out it was fake, right?
No International,
shit. Yeah. Oh, Amnesty International went to Libya. It was not true. Okay, they could not find anything to back that claim up. I mean, it didn't add up. Amnesty International said it's not real. Other people, but it's like that's a really nasty lie. I mean, and it's like when you tell a lie that's that nasty and that extreme, and it motivates people to then support the violent overthrow of a country that results in probably at this point at least hundreds of thousands of deaths, if not millions, right? Libya at this point is such a disaster. There are parts of the country that don't have electricity. There are people getting on rafts in the Mediterranean trying to flee to Europe. There were reports about open air slave markets and human trafficking. I mean, it's like you tell a nasty lie like that, number one. That lie then is used to justify an awful military intervention that destroys the country and kills hundreds of thousands of people. That should be a scandal, right? I mean, that's like Nuremberg kind of stuff. There was one of the guys who was executed and convicted at the Nuremberg trials was named Julius Streicher. And Julius Streicher, he didn't run any gas chambers. He didn't run any trains taking people to concentration camps. He was the propagandist who justified the Holocaust. He made children's books demonizing Jews. He made little films that were showed, and he was the guy who he didn't do the Holocaust. He did the propaganda for the Holocaust, right? And they hung him at Nuremberg for that. Well, I mean, look at what American media does. I mean, every time there's a war, they just turn up the volume with the lies. They just turn up the volume. Every rumor, everything, and then afterwards we find out it's not true. Great example. Just one more thing is the Naria testimony. Right? In the lead up to the Gulf War, this woman was crying. She was on CNN, like on loop, saying that Saddam Hussein's soldiers were taking babies out of incubators and throwing them on the floor. Turns out she had never been to the hospitals that she was talking about. The woman testifying was a member of the Kuwaiti royal family, and she wasn't even testifying under oath. The whole thing had been staged by a private PR firm. It was unbelievable, but the American people fell for it. They were convinced, oh, yeah, we have to send troops to fight Saddam Hussein. Look, they're throwing babies in incubators. It was a lie. It was just a big lie.
Yeah, I like to call it the Orientalist fallacy, where I'm not even sure Orientalist is, but you'll know what I mean. You can say anything. Make up any, like, insanely evil thing that is, like, ridiculous beyond any conception, and they'll believe it. Oh, Kim Jong-il said he bowled a perfect game or got 100 perfect hole-in-one golf game or whatever. And then I would say, how do you know that's true? And they would say, Oh, you know those people. They're always crazy, and we know they're
Yeah.
crazy because of these crazy things they do, and we know they did those crazy things because they're crazy. It's the whole circular reasoning behind all that, and it's very easy to scare people with the image of them bloody Islams, taking this, taking that. And I gotta admit, I've learned a lot about Iran just from being on Press TV. And even I admit at first I didn't really know anything. I wasn't like really anti or pro Iran. I was just like, whatever, just anti the war. That's the bottom line. But since then I've learned like quite a bit about how Iran is, and it's very, very far from the big scary turban man on top of everything, making a theocracy.
Right, and it's complicated. That's one thing. Before I went to Iran the first time, I talked with a lot of older communists, and they were telling me about, the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, where there were a lot of executions of people in Marxist factions. I must say, I was scared. I don't want to use obscenity here, but I was really scared to go to Iran being a communist, because I had heard that in Iran it's illegal to be a communist. There were all these executions and all of that, and I was very like, oh wow, well, if I go to Iran, I better be careful not to say anything Marxist. And I got to Iran, and that was not how it was at all. And I talked to a lot of people in Iran. In Iran, they actually have a very beautiful building called the House of Latin America, HOLA, which coordinates their relationship with Cuba and Venezuela and countries like that. And the people there are very, very knowledgeable about Marxism. And I talked to a lot of people who had been in Marxist groups at the time of the Iranian Revolution. And that, Iran has changed a lot. The aftermath of the Iranian Revolution was very, very ugly. Okay. And
Yeah,
that's that.
What happens after every revolution.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Bolsheviks, you have to remember, there were a lot of people in the left Socialist Revolutionary Party who got the death penalty. There were a lot of people in the Menshevik Party who got the death penalty. And that tends to happen in violent revolutions, is that there are different violent revolutionary factions. And after the old regime is toppled, those violent revolutionary factions proceed to start fighting with each other. And a lot of the Iranians that are in exile, I guess, that are Iranian communists that are around the world, in Europe and Canada and the United States or whatever, their memory of Iran and the Iranian Revolution is like frozen in that immediate aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, where there was a lot of killing and I mean, and it's complicated. First of all, Iraq invaded Iran, right? And Iraq was aligned with the Soviet Union. So a lot of Iranians and a lot of supporters of the Ayatollahs believed that Iranian communists would be supporting Iraq's invasion. So that was one thing. Another thing is that there were three major communist parties in Iran at the time of the revolution. The first was the Tuda party, which was like the CP, the mainstream communist party. The second was the Fedayeen, which was like a Maoist group that was like doing rural, like guerrilla warfare. The third was called Mujahideen Khalq, or
the MEK. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
familiar with them.
Yeah, they believed that their prophet Masoud Rajavi was a leader. He was like a messiah sent to Earth to usher in some kind of global Islamic Marxist revolution.
That's not materialism.
Right. And after the Ayatollah kicked them out of the Iranian government, right, for a while they were part of it because they were Islamo-Marxists or whatever, they then went on a killing spree. They blew up a meeting of Iranian parliament members, killed 81 members of the parliament. They just went on a killing spree throughout the country, bombings, assassinations. In fact, the current supreme leader of Iran, the reason he can't move one of his arms is because he was having a press conference and they showed up with a bomb disguised as a tape recorder. And it blew up and he was very badly injured on his arm, so he can't move one of his arms. So this group of people calling themselves communists, this wacky kind of, I think they're like the Iranian equivalent of Jim Jones, the People's Temple called in the United States, because that's basically what they were. Because it was like, Jim Jones claimed he was the combined reincarnation of Jesus and Lenin. And that's exactly what this Rajavi guy said. He said he was the combined, reincarnation of Jesus and Lenin or something like that. And, it was like this wacky, like suicide death cult that was calling themselves communists, was going on a killing spree. Iraq invaded the country. And in that context, there was a huge crackdown on communists, right?
Well, that does happen during wartime.
Yeah, and so that's why in the immediate aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, a lot of communists suffered. But, I met communists who were like tortured during that period, who still have said to me, it's a different country now. It's not the same as it was. And it's illegal. Yeah, in Iran, if you were to set up an official communist party, that wouldn't be permitted because that would be seen as being a party that would go against their Islamic constitution. But people study Marxism all the time. In the universities, I would say Marxism probably has a far bigger influence in Iranian universities, and that there are TV programs on Iranian television that give like a Marxist analysis of U.S. imperialism. The official name for their economic system, they call it not capitalism, but Islam. So, the world is a lot more complicated than people want to make it out to be. That doesn't excuse any of the atrocities that were committed. I'm not saying that what they did was correct. I'm certainly, there's big problems in Iran, and the Iranians are the first to tell you that. They need reform. They need modernization. But the question is, how can they do it, but keep strong their resistance to U.S. imperialism and Western capitalism, right? How can they reform and modernize and give people more human rights, but also stay true to their principles? And that's a big debate in the country right now, and there's many different opinions, many different opinions in Iran.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of aspects of Western culture that are to be rightfully criticized. Rape culture, for one. A lot of the hypersexualized culture in the West is bad, not because of some kind of religious morality, but because of the, well scientifically documented, history of, what happens if you pornify a culture. And that should be rightfully criticized, and they're right to resist that. And I think at the end of the day, that's something Iran has to decide for itself. That's not something that you can dangle a missile over their head and say, well, you know what, you're going to be the great, neoliberal order, or else. I mean, that has always been my position with Iran. Iran to be decided by Iranians, not from threats from the outside. And this is a very simple concept to understand. I mean, of course, there's some things I don't like about it. But the point here is that they have to decide that for themselves. They have to decide what their society should be, free from, threats of violence from, the imperialist bloc. And that seems to be really hard for some people to friggin' understand.
Indeed, absolutely. One thing I will mention that I find to be kind of amusing is that, a lot of people on the internet who call themselves Maoists really kind of glorify this little uprising that happened in Iran in like 1982. And the RCP and different groups talk about this like incident in Iran, like this was the moment where there could have been a revolution in Iran or something. I forget what it's called, but it was like this little incident. It's all over the internet. People talk about this little uprising. When I was in Iran, I actually asked my host, I said, what about this incident? And they had never heard of it. I pulled out my computer. I showed them the Wikipedia page for it. They still had never heard of it. They went and asked some other Iranian scholars about it. And it turns out that like this whole this incident that like a lot of these like internet Maoists think was this like glorious moment when there was a Maoist people's war against the Ayatollahs or something, it was like over within a few hours. Okay.
Yeah, right.
And the people who put it down didn't even realize it was Maoists they were fighting. They thought they were fighting Iraq. It was like the whole thing is just completely irrelevant to Iranians. It's like the whole thing never happened. I mean, it was just, the country was being invaded by Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and they were mobilizing to resist Iraq. And then there was like some weird little group of students had guns in some province and were calling themselves Maoist People's War. And it was over like 8 hours later, and no one even noticed. It was like, it's just considered to be like a non-incident in the history of the country. I found
in the context of the Greater War,
yeah,
it was a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me like Trotskyites, right? You talk to a lot of Trotskyites, they'll say, well, the Soviet Union was good from like 1917 till 1924, and after that it was bad. It was Stalinist. And it's like, you want to say, step back for a minute, okay? 1917, 15 different countries invade the Soviet Union, right? There's a blockade. Medicine cannot get into the Soviet Union. Food cannot get into the Soviet Union. The Red Army is fighting for its life against the White Army. There's awful things going on. You know, the Red Army is conscripting everybody. The White Army is forcibly conscripting everybody. The White Army is committing horrendous anti-Semitic atrocities, going to whole Jewish villages and just slaughtering everyone because they're this anti-Semitic thing. Well, if they're Jewish, they must be communists. You know, I mean, it was just a horrendous situation, the Russian Civil War, right? After the Russian Civil War, they're blockaded, right? I mean, and then Lenin implements the new economic policy so they can start to have like some small businesses to just barely get the economy going again. It's awful, right? This is the time Trotskyites think was good. Like, meanwhile, 1928, Stalin launches the 5-year plans. And all of a sudden, one of the most poor countries in the world is rapidly industrializing, getting electricity, getting housing, getting running water. Millions of people are being raised out of poverty. They're building some of the biggest electrical power plants in the world. They're like making like groundbreaking films with Sergei Eisenstein. They have the best ballet dancers in the world. They're like the rest of the world's having a Great Depression and everyone's in awe of what they're doing. And it's like this huge, huge construction effort and mobilization. And it's like even like some of the most pro-capitalist people in the world are going, wow, I've never seen anything like this. This is unbelievable. That's the bad time. That's when the evil Stalin, like these people are out of touch. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's beyond me. I mean, the time when Lenin and Trotsky, that was, I mean, you know, it was a bad time. The time when Stalin gets in is a time that for like the first time we see the Soviet Union rising up from nothing and building a strong socialist economy, an economy that then is able to finally withstand a Nazi invasion that kills 26 million people. I mean, it's like so Stalin, the years of Stalin are bad. The years of Trotsky, when millions of people are dying, there's a bloody civil war going on, people are starving, that's good. You know, does it ever strike you that these people might just be a little out of touch with like reality?
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
And we're not saying that Trotsky was responsible for any of that.
No, of course not. But it's to maintain that those were the good years, and the bad years were when Stalin was raising all these people out of poverty. It doesn't matter how people are actually feeling. It matters what's being written in the books, and that's one tendency that I see in a lot of leftists. It's like it doesn't matter how people's lives are actually affected. What matters is when people mutter the right magic Marxist words, right? You know, and that's a pet peeve. That's not materialism, you know? I'm sorry. You know, and I mean, the Stalin years had big problems too. We know about the Great Terror, they call it, the fear. That was in 1937. A lot of people were turning in their neighbors, and there was a lot of fear of Nazi spies, and there was a crackdown, and people have different interpretations of that period, but it was bad. You know, that was bad. But compared to the early years in the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, I mean, it was far better. I mean, people were eating every day. I mean, people had running water, people had electricity. So, I mean, it's just kind of shocking to me, and that's when I feel like in some cases, you know, being a leftist, and it can become more like religion and less like scientific Marxism. You know, when it's like, well, did the leaders say the right magical words? Well, that isn't exactly what should really matter in terms of politics. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I had that argument with a group of people once before. You know, results do matter. Like, you can claim that your ideological preference would do this or do that, but in the end, you know, results are very significant. They do mean something. Indeed.
What else is on your mind tonight, Jason?
What else? Nothing particularly. I mean, we've already been going for, you know, just over 2 hours, or 2 hours and 20 minutes, if you count that snafu at the beginning.
I think it's 1 hour, right? Because we started at 9 and it's a little after 10.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I also can't count.
That's okay. 1 hour is 2 hours. Hey, coronavirus, right? We're all stuck at home. It all seems the same. Corona streaming, right? Talking about the world. I'm sitting in my bed, drinking orange juice, talking to you over Skype. And, you know, hey, what can you do? I mean, I will say, you know, in my neighborhood in New York City, I have seen more homeless people recently than I've ever seen since I moved here. I've been in this neighborhood 6 or 7 years. I have never seen as many homeless people as I'm seeing right now.
Oh, that's right. And I saw another article that was showing that there are now more empty apartments than there has ever been in an insane amount of time. So you've got a massive increase in empty places to live with a massive increase of people with nowhere to live.
Yeah.
Wow, rational allocation of the market, right?
Indeed, indeed. I mean, it's classic, right? Capitalism is the first system in the world where people were homeless because there were too many houses, where people were hungry because there was too much food. In feudalism, people were homeless because there wasn't enough housing. In feudalism, people starved because there wasn't enough food. But capitalism is unique in giving the ability to create poverty amid abundance. And there's actually a relationship between poverty and abundance. And that is what is unique about capitalism. Yeah, and that is why that it is just, people want to go on all day about socialism not being good and all of that. Well, when there were food shortages in socialist countries, it was because there was not enough food. That makes sense. When people starve because there is too much food, you have a really big problem with your economic system. I mean, give me a break, right? I mean, there's the story they call the coal miner's riddle. It's about a coal miner, and it's cold in the home. So the son of the coal miner says to him, he says, "Father," says, "why is it so cold in here?" And he says, "Because I can't afford any coal to turn the stove on." And the son says, "Why can't we afford any coal to turn the stove on?" He says, "Because I got laid off from my job at the coal mine." And the son says to the father, "Why did you get laid off from your job at the coal mine?" He said, "Because there's too much coal." That's capitalism for you, right? That's our system.
Capitalism.
Indeed. And that under capitalism, the worker can only work so long as their work enriches capital, right? And their work only enriches capital if their boss can turn it into a profit. Therefore, if there's lots of abundance, if there's lots of products on the market, they don't need your labor as much, and you're not hired. I mean, this is, you actually had a really great video many years ago talking about the falling rate of profit and kind of the mathematics behind it. I watched it and I thought it was very brilliant. That was a very brilliant way of breaking it down. That's one thing I like about your channel, is that you do get into the economics of Marxism. You actually wrote a book on that, didn't you? Write like a Marxist introductory economic text?
Yeah, I took capital and made it as simple as I could, which, by the way, was not easy. Thank you, Marx, for having to write the way you did.
Yeah, I've heard people say that Marx is easier to read in the original German. I don't know if that's true or not. That just might be something people say, and unless you speak German, there's no way to test it.
Yeah, from what I understand, Marx wrote it that way because that was how intellectuals at the time wrote. And if you did, he wrote it in a manner of speaking, a dialectical way where he had both the thing and its opposite in the same ridiculous run-on sentence. But apparently that was the way you had to write back then if you were to be taken seriously as an intellectual. If you didn't do that, people, the intelligentsia wouldn't listen to you.
Yeah, I've heard people compare Marx's writing style to Hegel's. And I have not studied Hegel enough to really comment on that.
That is true, because that was the style at the time.
Well, Friedrich Engels, I've always found to be a much better writer, and the ideas come across much more clearly. I think the book Socialism, Utopian and Scientific is probably the most important book in the history of the Marxist movement, I think. It really lays it all out there in 3 quick chapters. It explains, first we learn about utopian socialism and the utopian socialist movement. Next, we learn about dialectics and what the dialectic is, the concept. Then we learn about historical materialism and how socialism could come into being on a scientific basis rather than a religious or utopian one. Boom, boom, boom. Very good stuff. And it clears up a lot of the misconceptions. People say crazy stuff now. I've heard people say Marx was not a statist. Marx did not believe in the state. And it's I don't know how anyone in their right mind can say that, because if you read Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, it's very clear the goal is to seize control of the state and have the state control the means of production. But that's a convenient, if you want to be an anarcho-liberal or whatever, that's a convenient thing to say. Obviously, with the Paris Commune, Marx is quoted as saying that, they don't want to just seize control of the ready-made state machinery. They want to build a new state, right? And that's true. In Venezuela, for example, they got elected and took control of the ready-made state machinery, but then they had a new constitution and took that state apart. And then they created Bolivarian circles and community organizations and collectivos and communes. They even have the Bolivarian militias that are separate from the regular military. They changed how the regular military works, so the regular military gets trained in Cuba. I mean, they had to completely change the nature of the state. They couldn't just seize control of the ready-made state machinery and just press go. And that's an important point. Lenin's book, The State and Revolution, really hammers that home. That right, I always try to lay out like programmatic things that we can advocate, like real demands. But honestly, look, if they said tomorrow, you know what, Jason, be the Prime Minister of Canada, right? You're all by yourself. You're the Prime Minister of Canada. What would you do? I mean, you couldn't build socialism on the basis of the Canadian state as it currently exists.
Oh, of course not.
Yeah, I mean, you would need to start the process of transitioning to a new state based in communities, based in working class assemblies. You know what I'm saying? Like the state itself, the way the capitalist state is set up is to serve capitalism. Just like, when they overthrew feudalism, they had to design a whole new type of government, right? They couldn't have absolute monarchs anymore. Well, when we move towards socialism, we're going to have to transition toward a new type of state. No question about it. And I think Lenin's book, The State and Revolution, is very important. I remember when I was in college, I took comparative politics, I took political theory. We never read that book. And so one time I raised my hand and I said to the professor, I said, why do we never read Lenin's book, The State and Revolution? And I remember my professor said, well, it's just not considered to be a relevant text in the history of political science. And I said, you do realize that at one point, 2/3 of humanity lived under governments that were modeled on that book. And her jaw dropped. Her jaw just dropped, right? Because you think about it, right? 2/3 of humanity. At the height of the Cold War, 2/3 of the human race was living under governments that were officially Marxist-Leninist governments. Therefore, their theory of how to govern was based on that book, The State and Revolution. If you're studying comparative politics, political theory, you would think that book would be pretty high on the list, right?
Well, you would think so, but, I'm just going to quietly pretend that book doesn't exist.
Indeed. I think it's interesting, when you talk about political theory, like there's this musical about Alexander Hamilton. It's like all the rage now in the United States. It used to be, the Communist Party USA used to be very supportive of Thomas Jefferson, the founder of the United States, so much so that they had their training school in New York City. They changed it from being the Lenin School to the Jefferson School, right? And the Communist Party was really pushing the idea that Thomas Jefferson was like the real revolutionary. But I've noticed that among left-wing circles in the United States, there's been a real shift. And now, when leftists do talk about the founding fathers of the United States, they actually are much more in admiration of Alexander Hamilton. And I think that's actually a correct shift. I think, unfortunately, I'm not supportive of a lot of ways the left has changed, but the fact that they're upholding Hamilton rather than upholding Thomas Jefferson is really great. I mean, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. He raped one of his slaves and had children with her. He advocated basically a free market economy. He glorified the yeoman, the small farmer. Well, Alexander Hamilton was opposed to slavery 100%, was vehemently against slavery. He was so much against slavery that after Haiti had their slave revolution, the first slave revolution when Haiti, the Haitian slaves rose up.
Yeah.
Alexander Hamilton was the only founding father of the United States who advocated having diplomatic relations with the Haitian slave revolutionaries. That alone makes him far more amazing and progressive than Thomas Jefferson, in my view. What do you think?
Yeah, Toussaint Louverture.
Yeah, I mean the fact that Alexander Hamilton advocated recognizing, and some of Hamilton's economic theories are a little more, the idea kind of that you should have a state bank that should build things like lighthouses, should sponsor the construction of infrastructure. That was kind of his idea, is that the government of the United States should kind of facilitate the growth of the United States as an economy. It was capitalist theory, right? It was just how do we build a capitalist economy for the United States? Thomas Jefferson was saying to be just totally free market about it. But Hamilton was saying we need a national bank. We need government stimulus programs. I think that Hamilton's economic theories were probably more beneficial in the long term. If they hadn't built the lighthouses, they hadn't started charging taxes on the products that were being imported to the colonies, they hadn't started doing that, there would have been some problems. But ultimately, I mean, this is the capitalist revolution, right? I mean, we're talking about capitalism. We're talking about an old revolution. We're talking about socialism as a whole new system. So, but it's worth thinking about. And I'm happy to see the shift. Earl Browder, the revisionist leader of the Communist Party, always really pushed Thomas Jefferson as being the good one. And I really don't have much admiration for Thomas Jefferson.
And nor should you.
No. But I think it's worth talking about. I mean, I think, we should know the history of our own country. I've it's interesting. I was trying to learn about Canadian communism, and I remember I ordered the 2 books that are available in print by Tim Buck. You know about Tim Buck?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think of Tim Buck?
I haven't read too much, but it seems like he was very much a product of the time. Mm-hmm. And I guess my main criticism would be not radical enough.
Okay.
But I also understand the context in which he was doing everything that he did. I mean, to be fair, communism here is more dead than it is in the United States.
Oh, wow.
It's not that it's as anti-communist as the United States is, but because we do have universal health care, because we do have much cheaper our education is not free, but it is, college and university are much, much cheaper. People see less of a reason to abolish the system. And the people that you do see that are arguing to abolish the system are the people who are much more marginalized, the indigenous population primarily.
Wow. Well, I saw an interview on the internet somewhere, like a TV interview with Tim Buck, where they asked him about the Sino-Soviet split, like just after it had happened. They asked his opinion about it. And I get the impression he was a very kind of folksy kind of guy, right? Like, it's kind of like, he was active in like the 1930s and up into the 50s and 60s. And, that he kind of had this like kind of folksy down home way of being. I get that impression. Mm-hmm. But they ask him about the Sino-Soviet split. And he says, well, there's truth on both sides of it. He says, the Soviet Union, they think that world peace is the most important thing. Then that everything should be done for world peace. The Chinese, on the other hand, they say that if we need to have a little war here or a little war there to stop the U.S. imperialists, why, that's a good thing and we ought to do it. I thought that was hilarious.
That's a little oversimplified.
I know, but it's sweet though. You know what I mean? It's I don't know. I mean, it's I don't know. I found it to be like charming in a way. And just kind of, when he uses the phrase a little war here or a little war there, I just thought that was, I don't know. It was very sweet. The Canadian.
I actually know more about Fred Rose. I don't know if you're familiar with Fred Rose.
Oh, tell me about it.
Fred Rose was a Canadian communist who actually got elected to Parliament.
Wow.
He actually got elected in a place called Gravenhurst, and Gravenhurst is the same place that Norman Bethune came from. I assume you know him because he's pretty famous in China. Yeah. Bethune and all that. So, communist, straight up, gets elected to Parliament. Next day, we have evidence that you're a Stalinist agent. Now, here's a trial that will take place in secret, and you're deported to Poland.
Wow. What year was that?
47. I believe it was 47.
Wow, that's intense. That's intense. Just basically for getting elected, they deported him.
Yeah, then they had a hidden trial. We can't reveal any of the information for national security reasons, and then the result was him being kicked out of the country.
Wow. That's pretty horrendous. That is pretty awful. Well, I also wanted to mention that now the Canadian who's probably the most famous in the USA, well, I shouldn't say that, there's other people, but when it comes to politics, the Canadian who probably has the biggest reputation is, Jordan Peterson, right? I mean, he's the one that people in political circles are talking about.
He's like He's kind of like our Justin Bieber of politics. He's there, but we try to pretend he's not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the man, when he talks about communism, he says things that are so wildly inaccurate. I mean, he says things like I heard him at one point say that Tsarist Russia was a paradise compared to what the Bolsheviks did. When I heard him say that, I'm thinking, like, really? There was no running water in most of Tsarist Russia. There was not electricity. Women didn't go to school. Like,
anybody didn't go to school.
Right. I mean, mass illiteracy. I mean, it's like, how can he say that with a straight face? And it's also weird, as I saw like a documentary, apparently he has like pictures of Lenin all over his house, even though he's like a vehement anti-communist. What sense does that make? Yeah.
I don't know. He's probably got his reasons, but yeah, he's the exception here, not the rule. I mean,
good.
Most academics here are like, oh, yeah, okay, that's good, Peterson. Now please go away.
Well, they're postmodern neo-Marxists, and I don't much care for them because, they're trying to impose Stalinism and get rid of our great capitalist system.
No one's trying to impose socialism here. That's goddamn ridiculous. They have been on a 50-year crusade to destroy the healthcare system here. Every government, whether that be liberal or conservative, has continually defunded healthcare.
You don't need communism. You need to just clean your room. Clean your room.
Well, I'll get to that one day.
Right. Indeed. Oh, boy. What else is new these days? Anything much?
Not really. I mean, I think we covered everything that we were going to cover in this one.
Okay, well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Jason. It really is.
Yeah, it was good.
No, I always have a good time, and I must say, keep doing what you're doing. You're not only making videos on the internet, but you're appearing on international television and giving great analysis of world events, and I'm very happy to see that. And a lot of people tune in to hear what you have to say. You're a loved voice, and keep doing what you're doing, and fight the good fight, right? I mean, I've noticed that I obviously I don't want to name any names, but you and I and some other good people have become the target of kind of a strange cyberbullying internet campaign. Have you noticed that?
Yes, and you notice that came right after I started showing a lot of solidarity to people.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. But hey, there's in the Little Red Book, I think Mao says to be attacked by the enemy is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Right? And the modern version of that is life is like a video game. If you're encountering enemies, you're going the right way.
Oh, I've never heard that one. That's pretty good. Well, keep doing what you're doing. My best wishes to you. And,
same to you.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you soon then. Okay?
All right.
Sound good?
Yep. See you later, everyone.
Yep.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah, okay.